Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, How to Fill in the Gaps of ESG Data for Investing. We have an amazing panel of subject matter experts in this space, and we are excited to kick off this conversation. Please utilize the Q&A button as you think of questions throughout, as we will have time at the end to address them. To begin, we have two quick poll questions just to kind of understand who is in our audience today and help guide the panel as they go through the questions. So I'm going to launch the first poll. What is driving ESG in your business? Give people 10 more seconds to answer. So we're seeing a good amount of people that are seeing ESG driving their business to help manage investment risks. And we have a lot of people in the audience today that would love to learn more about this topic. So that's really great to hear. You're in the right place. And then our second poll today is, what is your company's approach to ESG scoring? Give people 10 more seconds. All right. So this one is a pretty much mixed bag. Some people are using traditional ESG scoring. Some people have their own in-house solution to manage the scores and create new ones. And some people are not using them at all or looking for a third party to help. So this is a great start for what we're going to be talking about later in the discussion. So thank you all for participating in these polls. And before we dive in, I would like to just give a brief introduction to who Accern is and how we are positioned in the ESG space, just to give everyone an understanding about how this discussion came about. So Accern is a no-code AI platform built for finance that helps identify ESG investing risks and opportunities using news and alternative data by capturing hard-to-find signals to give a more complete understanding of a company's ESG behaviors. Our panel today will uncover the current gaps that exist, challenges they are seeing in this space, and tactical examples of how investors are integrating ESG data into their investment process. I would now like to introduce Ruben Alba from Accern's Strategic Partnerships team, who will be moderating today's panel. Ruben has over 15 years of experience in partnership and business development in different industries, with the last 2 years in the fintech industry, and he is currently working with a myriad of partners and clients in the ESG space at Accern. Over to you, Ruben.
Thank you, Brianna. Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Ruben Alba, and I'm going to be your host today. We are so excited that you guys were able to connect. I know we have people from different geographies and time zones. Also, we have a great panel with us, and I'm hoping you and I are able to ask questions during this event to get their insights on the topic. As you can see, this is an ambitious agenda, so without further delay, I am delighted to introduce our panelists. We have Tamara, CFA, founder and managing director of Close Group Consulting, a boutique ESG advisory firm that uses in-depth capital markets and ESG expertise to assess, design, and implement tailored end-to-end ESG integration practices across different asset classes. Bohn from Ernst & Young, senior manager, which primarily provides consulting, assurance, tax, and transaction services to its clients. Ryan is currently leading the Sustainable Finance Initiative for their U.S. Financial Services Office. Vittoria Bufalari, Senior Associate Consultant and ESG Data and Analytics Lead at KKS Advisors, an advisory services firm helping clients to find innovative solutions that enable the creation of more sustainable business models and communities. Ronan Crosson, CFA, Director, Data Strategy and Analytics at Eagle Alpha, a marketplace specializing in alternative data, which connects data buyers with data vendors. Anshul Pandey, Ph.D., Accern CTO and co-founder, who leads the AI technology and innovation efforts at our company. So let's start speaking about the current limitations you are seeing or personally facing in the ESG data landscape. For starters, Vittoria, according to ERM, there were almost 600 ESG ratings and rankings registered in 2020. They must have used different methodologies, coverage, scores, rating cycles, among others. In your experience, what are ways you have seen them align or misalign with reality?
Thank you, Ruben. So, I mean, certainly a few cases come to mind when we think about how, ESG ratings and ESG data sort of deviate from reality, especially if you think about using ESG data or a specific provider or a specific product as your sort of one-stop shop for your ESG analysis and insight. And also as a premise to my answer, I come from like the standpoint and the viewpoint of a user of ESG data, especially from sort of like an asset management standpoint. So thinking about how can we leverage sort of large scale data solutions in sort of portfolio management applications, especially equity portfolio management applications. So this is the viewpoint that I take. So if you think about using a specific, any given really ESG rating or ESG data product as your one-stop shop for your ESG analysis in investment practices, then you're likely doomed to fail because there are so many inherent limitations in any given ESG data provider, and all of the limitations are valid. There is no one sort of solve all problem solutions currently in the ESG data landscape, and actually any limitation can be seen as an opportunity to improve the insights that you can give by mix and matching different data providers, by using alternative data solutions, using sort of internal or external research efforts to improve and sort of fill in the gaps, the knowledge gap that is inevitably created by sort of large scale solutions like those provided by ESG ratings. A good example of this is that comes to mind is the PG&E example. So American electric utility company, they back in 2018, I believe they were found sort of guilty for causing some of the wildfires in Northern California, San Francisco area, due to sort of like spark inducing faulty equipment. So the physical assets of the companies, of the company, and sort of located in this high wildfire risk zone that is Northern California. And so the controversy, or the interesting fact of this matter was that at the time, even before the incidents and before the wildfires, if you were to look at PG&E's environmental scores or the governance scores, it was sort of across the board found with positive performance, no major red flags. You would be able to find if you were to look at ESG ratings, but the reality of the matter was different, and the reason behind the lack of sort of factoring in that material risk factor specifically for PG&E of the wildfire risk exposure, so the physical aspect of climate change, came from an inherent limitation of some of these data providers that need to have very scalable solutions and methodologies to be able to assess companies' performance and risk management on a broad set of material or relevant ESG factors for many different industries and across the globe, and with very large samples. So inherently, it's it becomes impossible to be able to capture sort of company specific and location specific issues, first of all. And then even if you were able to identify those, then being able to access the information to, in order to assess then a company against these factors, or, even from a regional standpoint, it becomes very challenging. So this is an example of how, the inherent limitations of some of the ESG rating providers can actually be used as sort of an initiative, right, for investors to do their own research and collect different data, use alternative data sources or information sort of gathering processes to complement whatever missing information may be in a rating.
That's an excellent example, and I remember how rating agencies were giving good rates to PG&E. Whereas they were already having problems, and you could have foreseen the bankruptcy at least 1 or 2 years in advance. Thank you for that, and that opens the floor for the next question. Ryan, how have you seen or helped organizations get closer to reality when reporting on their ESG data?
Great question, Ruben, and thank you all for having me today. I appreciate it on the panel, as well as my fellow panelists. But kind of picking off what Vittoria said, I think the challenge with a lot of this data is it's dated too. It's historical. So you're also operating with some of this limited information that's potentially a year or so older. But as it relates to working with firms as an ESG data, 3 main use cases that we've seen. Net zero strategy. There's been a big emphasis recently from the banking industry on that. Climate risk is another one. And then also impact measurement. So maybe just breaking down each of those 3 components a little bit. So as I mentioned, net zero strategy, 5 largest US banks have signed up to the Net Zero Banking Alliance, most recently with JP Morgan and Wells Fargo coming on board. And this is fundamental as it relates to the quantification of financed emissions. Ultimately, what banks' contribution is to the greenhouse gas emissions, if you will. So being able to understand what they're contributing to the economy, to be able to understand how they're going to support their transition to net zero. And then ultimately being able to set targets to reduce their emissions related to all of those different lending relationships that they've had. So types of data that's used for the net zero strategy, primarily greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. That being said, once again, along the limitation perspective, it's often an estimation exercise based upon the data and the reliability of that information being disclosed. And working with one of the firms, I think scope 1 and 2 was around 52% of it was estimated. Scope 3 was almost 80%. So that's one where the industry definitely has a way to go as it relates to being able to have more verifiable, valid data. Sources for this information comes from the standard setters that are out there, as well as a number of ESG vendors, CSR reports, annual reports, or various company reports. So there's a need to gather all this information in a very unstructured way to be able to then quantify it from a baseline perspective and build on that from a target setting perspective. And as it relates to the impact of net zero, there's a huge focus of really being able to change the paradigm of banking. Banks are realizing that they need to develop client engagement strategies to help their transition. So being able to incentivize them to reduce their emissions, ultimately to have a benefit for the banks as well as their clients.
Thank you, Ryan. That's very interesting because the 3 strategies that you mentioned are mostly on the environmental pillar, so to speak. And that opens the floor for the next question, Ronan. Some articles express that the next phase of good governance is the management of environmental and social issues risks. What limitations have you seen with the availability of data for these 3 aspects?
Yeah, thanks to Accern for the invite to speak today. The gaps we're seeing, well, if we think about it in terms of company reported data, there are a lot of gaps. If you're trying to measure ESG, scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, as Ryan pointed out, there's probably better disclosures there. A certain amount of it is estimated, but beyond that, when you look at scope 3, when you look at biodiversity, waste management, other emissions, there's very little company reported data, and the data that's there it might not be audited. So then you're looking at other sources for that data, and that's really what we do as a company is all focused on alternative data, not just for ESG, but more broadly looking at new data sources outside of the reported entity. And we can get into it, like that's in environmental. On the social side, when we're looking at alternative data, there's quite good coverage for human capital side. So for things on the human capital side, if we think things like labor practices, employee engagement, diversity, inclusion, those kind of things. There's actually quite good data. There's employment data sets out there collected by, whether it's web crawling, it's a primary source. So on the social side, you have good coverage of human capital, but not so good coverage of the social capital the aspect of human rights, customer privacy, access and affordability, those kind of concepts. And that's where we're spending a lot of time understanding, mapping the market, understanding what data sets could lend themselves to that. And then as we look at governance, it's similar. You have to really get into the weeds. And in fact, I'm working on a paper at the moment we'll be publishing in the next year, so specifically on alternative data for governance. Because if we think of governance kind of in the MSCI framework of splitting it between corporate governance and corporate behavior, there's quite good data for corporate governance, because that's a lot of that around the board and pay and that kind of data is reported publicly. But corporate behavior, ethics, those kind of concepts, there's a lot less data. And again, we're mapping the market, looking at opportunities. One area we frequently come back to is NLP on alternative data sets, the kind of work that Accern do, particularly in the social side, understanding the external perception of the social credentials of a company, because to the extent that is the reality of their social credentials, it's what are their employees saying, what are their customers saying about them.
Thank you, Ryan. Very, very complete overview of the data on these three pillars. Maybe we can come back afterwards on how to solve this problem of not having audited information, which is clearly important when it comes to predict or doing analysis for the ESG scoring. The next question is for Tamara. According to Harvard Law School Forum on Corporate Governance, only 1 out of the top 10 ESG data providers is offering data on private companies. Could you speak a little bit about the limitations of data in the private sector?
Sure, thanks, Ruben, and thanks for having me here today. So data really starts, right, with disclosures from the companies. So in the private sector, the privately held companies, we do see less disclosure from those companies. So then it's harder to make it up into the ESG rating providers. However, there definitely is much more pressure on privately held companies to disclose. One of those reasons being just if you're a company today and you want to be in the supply chain of a larger company, and that company is going to be reporting on their scope 3 or supply chain ESG issues, then you, if you are wanting to be in that supply chain, then need to start reporting on those things. So we're seeing much more pressure on those privately held companies, even though they're not necessarily pressure from the regulators, to report on those issues. And we're also seeing ESG being integrated throughout the financing life cycle of a firm. So even at the VC, so seed capital and Series A fundraising, you are seeing investors asking for ESG issues and asking for ESG data and metrics. So I think going forward, we will see much more data coming from those privately held companies. But it's important to note too that ESG data, as the panelists have mentioned today, it's not perfect and it will not be perfect. It's like Ryan had mentioned, right? It's historical data and backwards looking data. And right now we're used to, when we're as investors, we're used to calculating risk and having the data tell us where those risks are. But with ESG, it's forward looking. We can't back test these issues. So for investors, even if that data is not complete, it doesn't mean you shouldn't use it. Absolutely should be an input to your investment decision, but understanding that you also have to bring in your own insights to make a decision when you're using that data.
Thank you. So as we have spoken about some of the limitations, there's one important, which is the lack of regulations and maybe There are some standardized frameworks, but there is not a consensus in which one to use, right? So it's difficult to identify ESG data providers who present information with transparent methodologies. Also, the companies presenting, as you have said, Tamara, ESG reports have not put in place audits, and this can create concerns over the greenwashing of sustainability performance. What have you personally seen done or have done to fill in these report gaps? And if you can share some examples. This is open to all the panelists, and whoever wants to start, please go ahead.
I can start. Thank you. So, you know, there are, as I mentioned, the way that I personally have used ESG data for research work or, you know, client engagements more broadly, again, in the context of portfolio analysis, backtesting efforts, and so forth, we need a good, sort of a large sample of data. We need good coverage, and the coverage is simply not there for a lot of these issues, especially on the social side. I found that, yes, while, Ronan, it is difficult to sort of define some governance quality issues, from what I've seen and what I've gathered, you know, some of the data out there is sort of higher quality on the governance side, more so than the social side. So a lot of the challenges that I personally found is more so on the social front, because it is inherently based on disclosures that are simply not there. So in order to sort of address some of the limitations that that come from the data gaps, whether that is, you know, historically, so you're missing basically a piece of time series for a specific company, or, you know, you're missing data altogether for some companies in your sample. There are a few, I guess, techniques that you can use. So first of all, you can look at sort of adding different data sets, right? Whether that is raw data to supplement a lack of ESG ratings, different data providers to sort of mix and match, as I mentioned before, and, you know, hoping that the coverage of, you know, across data providers differs, and, you know, some of those gaps get filled in. Alternatively, you know, you can look for proxies. So look at alternative data sets, you know, even open source data sets to help you, I guess, build a methodology, or, you know, like a set of rules to basically fill in whatever gaps. It's not about really getting the estimate, you know, an accurate estimate more so, but rather trying not to skew the distribution too much, right? And like still being able to run your models and your statistical analysis. And then the final approach, which tends to be a little bit more debatable because you get into statistics and into the sort of like the reasons why the data is missing, why it is there, why it's not, etc. You know, there are plenty of statistical approaches to data imputations, from, you know, regression based all the way to fancy sort of algorithms, machine learning techniques. And we've done all of that, but, you know, it bears sort of consideration the fact that it's there are some statistical assumptions behind the missingness of the data that you have to make that, you know, not everybody may be comfortable with, but are useful to, you know, get to the point and, you know, have your proof of concept, basically.
Thank you.
I might jump in there as well. So our focus is clearly on alternative data and finding new data sets that can substitute where there are gaps. And so like we've mapped 1,600 data sets. We've then tagged to 26 categories. So ESG is one category within that. But that's simply data vendors that self-describe or self-define as ESG. So that could be an NLP approach to ESG scoring. But within those other 25 categories, in a lot of instances, there are ESG applications for those categories. So I mentioned employment data, for example, and that's a great data set for the human capital side of social capital, or of the social pillar. And actually, I'd agree with Vittoria, like social, I think, is the greatest challenge, particularly, and I'm thinking in the SASB framework. I know there's a question in there around how do you define social capital? I don't define it. SASB have defined it. And so they're capturing things like affordability, availability, and these kind of concepts. But so if we're thinking about the other data set categories that we suggest to our clients to help them build out their ESG frameworks, it's employment data. So that could be coming from job listings on corporate sites, or it could be coming from public career professional profiles. It could be from filings, hard to find filings from the IRS, these kind of data sets. Patent data is another area that can be used as a proxy understanding the investment in environmental technologies. Again, that's more forward looking. It doesn't necessarily tell you what's happening now, and it's not backward, but that's the point, right? It's forward looking, seeing who's investing. Those, and then I mentioned the other category I frequently come to, and it's not just because I'm on an Accern webinar, is using NLP approaches to parse really large data sets, whether that's web data, whether it's NGO reportings or filings, to get a better estimate of some of these ESG factors.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I think there's no one provider that we mentioned that's going to provide all the data that you need. So if from a climate risk perspective and conversations that I have with clients, I know 5-10 vendors that they're looking to gather to really help support credit assessments and scenario analysis. And once again, you're gathering like geospatial information, being able to understand like building codes, resiliency standards, supply chain implications. So there's a combination or ecosystem of vendors that you're going to rely on and pull from to really have that complete picture, because not all of them are created equal and they're going to complement one another.
Yeah, so if I, go ahead, please.
Maybe I just quickly add, and just echoing what everyone else has said, it's also really important when you're looking at this data to not look at it in isolation. So if you're looking at something like health and safety statistics, or accidents or near misses at 2 manufacturing firms, one could have a lower level of accidents than another. And so if you're just looking at that in isolation, you would assume it's a more sustainable company or with a better health and safety track record, but it could just be that the company is less transparent and has, less of a governance and oversight framework in place. So it's really important. They're all interconnected, the economic, the environmental, and the social issues. So just really important to keep that in mind when you're doing your analysis.
Yeah, Anshul.
Sorry, or the company is being quite strategic and sneaky with their with what they disclose. And yeah, there are case studies of that, like assessments being, off the charts and very positive, but that's marketing. So.
That's true. That's actually also very true. Even the customers whom we work with at Accern, like a couple of, I think, high-level points that we all covered here, they apply almost to the full breadth of the customers who are using our platform. So availability of various types of ESG scoring methodologies, right? So there are so many vendors, everyone have their own scope and range and methodology, all the different variables. Some of them are utilizing black box approaches in the hindsight. And as I think originally Vittoria and Tamara, you said, most clients are actually looking for complementary data sets. They're not really sticking with one. They are looking for as many types of vendors as possible so that they can fill holes. And again, each vendor has their own expertise around what they bring to the table. So I think that is definitely one of the first pieces, which also relates to the problems that our customers are facing, which is how can I get all of these complementary data sets pretty much all at one place, where I don't really have to think about the sequential procurement of each individual data set and evaluation and everything. I think then the second point, which is, sure, I got access to the data. Now, how can I then maybe combine them? Again, like reconciling these data sets, it's fairly difficult. It's very, very difficult. And we have even seen customers who originally wanted to reconcile 2 different vendors and decided that they would rather build everything in-house and maybe take ideas from some of these vendors. And I think the third, which is also very critical, which again, I think Tamara, you mentioned, is the ability to bring your own insights in that whole broader scoring strategy. So that customizability of the solution, and that again, like if I have a new idea around employment data set, right, something that is very specific, a specific type of factor that I'm looking for in maybe a corporate document, and I want to bake that into my overall ESG scoring, that ability to bring my own ideas and my own data set and insights, I think those are also fairly important problems that our customers are also trying to solve right now.
Thank you, Anshul. That's a very good compliment, because we have seen like the business side of the ESG data, but now you're introducing us a little bit more into the technical side of it. This is an open question for all of you. As investors are placing more emphasis on company disclosures, ESG integration and rating agencies, what types of information are they looking for relating to mitigating greenwashing concerns? What is it investors are looking today?
I would start off with consistent, comparable data. Standardized is one of the things that's a challenge across the industry that I've seen, and being able to anchor it to existing frameworks. But there's a proliferation of frameworks out there. Which ones do you choose? Do they differ by asset class? Do they differ by sector? So I think there's a combination of factors that you need to think through to be able to make sure what you need, Ruben.
Yeah, and I've seen there's been some great analysis looking at the difference between what a company says and what a company does. And you know, alternative data is giving you a perspective of what they're doing. It's not company reported information, and comparing that side by side can give you a really good sense of who's greenwashing. You know, I keep coming back to the NLP example. I promise I'll use another example next time, but there's some great analysis looking at NLP on company disclosed information versus public information, and looking at it within the subtopics of ES and G, and looking at the difference in the two, and you can see some stark comparisons. And I think that to me, that's some of the best representation and articulation of greenwashing.
Maybe just to add on to what I said, like making it measurable. I think that's one of the things that I've also had conversation with clients on. So focusing less on outputs, more on outcomes. So what is the impact relative to like social, jobs created, economic output, as it relates to energy, like the environmental reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Those specific attributes are, I think, really make it more clear to demonstrate what the impact is, rather than potentially qualitative statements that firms have put out there previously.
Anyone else want to add something? Tamara?
Sure, maybe I'll just add, it's really tough, right, to see from the data whether the company is greenwashing or not. And often with the companies, we see a lot the disclosures that are driving the strategy, the ESG strategies at a company, where really it should be the strategy driving the disclosures, but there's so much pressure on the companies to disclose. So having the mix, like Ronan had mentioned, with the alternative data on top of sort of the more traditional data providers, gives you a really good view of is the company actually saying what is the company actually doing what they say they're doing, to have that mix. So not just relying solely on the disclosures.
Thank you. Great answers. I think we are having a glimpse on different aspects of the ESG data. Anshul, coming back to the problems that your customers are facing in the ESG space and the trend of in-house analysis, how are these challenges being approached by artificial intelligence? And what is the value added for investors for using this technology?
Sure. So I think at the high level problems that we discussed, one is access to the data. That's critical. There AI doesn't really have a strong part to play. However, any team that's really thinking about an AI adoption for an ESG scoring point of view, it's a very, very big component that they really have to solve. It's a nice engineering problem to solve, which is how can I procure all these data sets and then again standardize or try to reconcile them in a nicer way. And second, which is related to bringing my own insights in the overall ESG scoring methodology. I think that is where we are seeing AI playing a very, very strong role. So really taking a feedback, a user feedback, some kind of a data that they're providing. So let us say, just taking the disclosure example. So I found in the company's disclosure certain appearance of certain keywords, which I believe should be accounted for in the overall ESG scoring methodology. I can basically create a new kind of taxonomy. So now there are tools that are available, and Accern also offers it, which allows my customers to create a new concept, a new factor, a new taxonomy, and then take kind of compute quantitative metrics, which can be then fed back to my overall ESG scoring model. So overall, the ability to go from some raw data or like some data that's available with a vendor or multiple data sets to say, then combine them with say alternative data sets or NLP based data sets from say web scraping or company disclosures, and then bringing my own additional insights to eventually giving a dashboard or an API that basically tries to combine everything, provides like a consensus based scoring. I think that is where we are seeing lots of AI companies and AI models coming into picture, which are at the bottom line really reducing that whole time to value. So going all the way from accessing the data to something that you can really test and again forward test, or like just take some recent examples and do confirmatory analysis, like say on PG&E examples, and then basically do that deployment. I think that is where AI is playing the biggest role in this whole equation.
Perfect. Thank you. The next question is for Ryan. Regulation plays an important role in the ESG space. What ESG regulations have you seen in place currently, and how can organizations prepare themselves to what's coming?
Regulations, yeah, it is definitely coming. It's primarily, I think, was a voluntary exercise previously in ESG, but it's been definitely have accelerated in Europe. So I think the ones that I've seen most recently with clients is around the EU taxonomy, SFDR, as well as NFRD. And then specifically within the US, the SEC has really heightened the focus last year with the HR rule, and more recently with the climate letters that went out to a number of institutions to be able to articulate that they need to disclose climate related risks to their organization as it relates to the 2010 guidance. So I think as firms think about the regulations and how they're going to adopt with them, there's going to be vendors that we've talked about that they're going to have to source this information from, but also a lot of information internally that I think they're going to rely on and likely repurpose for a new use case. So that unification, Anshul, that you mentioned before, of like new data that they need to gather from an ESG perspective with existing exposure information is really going to be key for firms to set themselves up for success to be able to meet these regulatory requirements.
Okay. The next question is open for all the panelists. Alternative data has become a very important component of the ESG analysis, as you have mentioned. What are the kinds of alternative data that you have seen in the ESG market, and what are the ones that have been the most useful to you?
So I've actually had a very good experience using sentiment-based data. So, you know, the ESG data, we're talking about ESG data and we're talking about ESG ratings, but the ESG data landscape is quite varied, and, you know, the offerings and the products that you find in this big sort of pot, right, of products, you know, differs in the way I see it in three ways. First of all, like the thematic scope. So you can have products that are looking kind of across the board ESG issues. So they will account for E, S, and G topics and issues, or you have sort of more specific, more targeted ES or G issue products. Then the second way is the assessment type. What is the objective of the data? And so this is what sort of the ESG ratings will typically try to give you a measure, an assessment of a company's management of their ESG risks or opportunities. So it's kind of like a risk management, risk exposure type of assessment. But then you can also find data providers that are looking to give you an assessment of a company's impact, for example, on the environment, or in a more direct sense to society, like communities, customers, so on and so forth. Or, you know, providers that want to give you an assessment of the stakeholder sentiment of companies' ESG practices, sort of on relevant ESG issues. So these are, while the impact data is certainly the way I see it, and I think a lot of players in the market will agree, is kind of like the future of ESG, you know, like opening the doors, you know, from internal practices of companies and the impact of ESG factors on the company to, okay, what is then the impact of the company's actions on you know, the rest of the world, whether that's, as I said, environment or more directly societies. Sentiment assessment is a little bit more developed at this point, you know, sentiment analysis of ESG practices, and you know, there are many players out, well, some players out there, and that is a useful data set in different ways. First of all, it doesn't rely on self-disclosure, you know, on companies' disclosure. It just relies on, you know, news and again, as I mentioned, sort of stakeholder interest on a company's actions. So it takes away, right, like the reliance on non-standardized, non-mandated ESG disclosures. The frequency of the data, because this is another limitation of ESG data, because it is backward-looking and again disclosure-based. The frequency, if you look at a time series of a company's ESG data, your traditional providers will give you maybe annual frequencies. They'll give you quarterly frequency, but the variation is not really meaningful. But if you're looking at sentiment-based data, those data sets tend to be, you know, quite, they have a very high frequency because they are based on news and, you know, plus fancy methodologies, right, to update those. And then thirdly, I mean, it gives it another lens, right? It gives you a completely different lens that is, from what I've seen, often uncorrelated with traditional factors. Again, from a portfolio management standpoint, a lot of the ESG data tend to be, especially if you put a materiality lens on it, they tend to be correlated, highly correlated with traditional factors. So the way that a lot of people think of ESG integration is, okay, let's make our quality factor a little better, you know, like a little, better. But if you're looking at sentiment analysis, those data sets tend to have less correlation with sort of current methodology, well, not methodology, but data sets, and therefore can, you know, be used to extrapolate, you know, new signals that are not really, they're not really being seen across the board by managers.
Thank you.
I might jump in there. So we we've a carve out. We offer a carve out of our 1,600 data vendors just for ESG, around, you know, 120, 130 so ESG vendors. So I could talk all day about the topic. But we take, like I talked about things like employment data, like patent data, like NLP and AI. But we think of, you know, within each of ESG, you know, within environmental, satellite data is one area that we're seeing a lot of interest in, using satellite data to estimate emissions from facilities. On the social side, seeing some really interesting analysis of data security, cybersecurity and data security, and vendors that are ranking different companies based on their assessment of their cybersecurity. And on the governance side, we're seeing actually an interesting approach to the governance question is tracking the track record, or analyzing the track record of a management team as opposed to a company. So looking at this management team as they've moved between companies through their career, how have you can look at that purely on a shareholder return perspective, but you can look at it from an ESG perspective. How have they performed? However you're measuring ESG, how have that management team performed as they've moved through companies, rather than looking at that single company, because obviously management or governance is a lot of governance conversation is around the management team.
Perfect. Thank you. That being said, with the different kind of data and the trend of customers creating their own in-house analysis, Anshul, can you tell us a little bit of how Accern has helped investors to build their own solutions?
Sure. So I think definitely no one really wants to build everything from scratch, right? Like that's not the best utilization of people's time and money. But like, for example, one of the biggest asks that we saw when we were starting Accern was, hey, can you just bring in all these pre-trained models, so say sentiment models that are fine-tuned for ESG kind of news? Can you bring taxonomy or classification models that are fine-tuned, say, for SASB standards, right? So given any document, could the model quickly identify where the mentions of environmental factors are and so on? So I think with regards to our customers, what they have loved so far is we give them, in a way, a unified data store, so they can really like just access certain data sets. They can flip a button and say, okay, now I have access to news data, now I have access to blogs data, I have access to social media, and so on. Second is we have created a fairly large catalog of pre-trained models and that are combined with some of these standards. So you don't really have, if you want to do an NLP on public news data, utilizing SASB standards, it's already there. You just flip a button and now the documents will be analyzed by SASB standards. Versus you wanted to bring some of your own ideas, and you can also bring in your own ideas and build new models. And third is essentially their ability to very quickly integrate those output in whatever the eventual workflows that they are using, whether it's a BI tool like Power BI, or maybe a data science team wanted to utilize those metrics to add some features to their models, so they would get access to an API. So for our customers, what we have seen is they really love this ability to really go from just accessing the data to just at least evaluating whether or not that idea really makes sense, and get a sense of whether or not certain data sets add value. And I think that is where we are really fitting in the equation. We are essentially a no-code AI platform. We want to just be a backbone of AI as people adopt AI for the ESG strategies.
Okay, thank you. It is a shame that time flies by so quickly. We have 10 minutes more, so maybe we can start with some of the Q&A from the public, if you don't mind. I'm going to start with the first one. How much of reporting for some issues, for example, carbon, is a lack of industrial and technological innovation, and how do you drive innovation? It seems there is a large potential market here. Why aren't scientists and innovative business involved?
I'll give a reaction just based on some of the work that we've done with net zero. I think it's potentially less of a technological innovation, but more of just firms not having the ability to be able to measure this information and capture it. They haven't done it previously, specifically greenhouse gas emissions. That being said, as it relates to them being able to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, technology innovations, carbon capture, utilization, and storage is going to be key foundational components. So firms being able to invest in that type of technology is going to hopefully reduce their emissions. And then as it relates to scientists involved, I've come across a number of roles with the banking industry of climate scientists joining and helping partner across the risk analytics organization as well as the front office. So I think that's where we're going to see a blend of financial services and the science expertise really be able to come together to help solve some of these challenges, specifically from an environmental perspective.
Thank you. Anyone else wants to chime in on this question?
I was just maybe going to add something to Ryan's point. You know, for us looking back, it just makes sense that all companies should be spending money on this and budgeting, you know, to innovation and ROD. But you know, the reality of it is they have limited capital that they can employ or deploy, I should say. So it really goes to the business strategy of the firm. And there are those firms that really are integrating as part of their business strategy, and it's being managed at the board level, and they really are allocating capital to R&D and innovation, especially around things like net zero. But it's hard too, you know, if you're in the industry, if you're the first mover, maybe it will be a competitive advantage for you, maybe it won't be. So there's a lot of sort of that analysis that's going on behind the scenes to determine if you're really going to be able to allocate that capital to R&D and innovation.
Thank you. So the next question. What specific single quantitative measure of success at the portfolio level can be used that combines both financial performance and firm's own performance? Hopefully well-researched and well-considered total ESG rating of central concern. That's the question. I don't know who wants to address that one.
Go on, Vittoria. I'll let you answer that.
I was gonna throw in the concept of attribution analysis. So just reading the question, I think the person was asking, how can we basically find a way to understand what is the contribution of, you know, ESG factors to financial performance, and like what measures can we use? So you know, we've developed to look at some methodologies for carrying out attribution analysis to ESG factors. And, you know, this is not anything new, just from an approach standpoint. You know, attribution analysis is quite common, but it's done usually on sort of asset allocation, and it's doing it on ESG is, you know, easier said than done. However, you know, you can develop internal methodologies to understand the contribution of your ESG integration methodology. So whether that is including ESG, sort of financially material ESG information to your valuation models, and then basically trying to tie the inclusion of that information to the realized performance of your investment, whether that it's at a security level or at a portfolio level. That it can also be done in the context of exclusionary policies, or, you know, any type of screening or best-in-class approaches. So not just necessarily tying it back to valuation, but, you know, there are some best practice, I would say, is to do this.
Ronan, I think you were...
Yeah, I was going to say it's not possible, to be honest. They're measuring two separate things. And for the regulators, to be honest, don't care. Like if you think of SFDR, ultimately the goal of SFDR is about directing capital towards more sustainable activities. So you could argue if you align yourself with that goal, well, then you should outperform the market. But trying to put a single measure on it is not possible. And I know that that's really hard to accept for all of us who have are more quantitatively oriented. We want to have a single measure of success, and you know, our clients traditionally are on the. I'm thinking my buy side background, but the trustees or the ultimate asset owners traditionally have looked at portfolio returns as that single measure. The challenge now, and I think what you need to do is convince the asset owners of that you either agree on what your benchmark is for your ESG efforts, whether that's MSCI or a third party, or whether it's something proprietary that they agree with, and then you use that to measure you over time, and track that, and separate to that, track investment return. And unfortunately, the two are measuring very different things, and there's not a single measure that you can apply to answer both questions.
Those are excellent points, Ronan, and I agree 100%. I think, you know, hopefully going forward, this one measure will be some type of measure of impact. So a way for us to be able to measure with, you know, with a dollar sign, right? Like the impact of ESG, and, you know, that is gonna allow us to tie it back to financial performance in a more, you know, in a more direct, effective way, but also from a meaning standpoint, we're actually measuring impact. So hopefully, like in the future, this is what the answer will be.
Thank you. So I want to be cognizant of everybody else's time, and we have 3 minutes, so this is going to be the last question. As you collate multiple data sets to augment your ESG approach, who is the arbitrator for what is salient to end user populations? How can you bridge end user voice via stakeholder engagement to bolster your methods and overall frameworks to attribute local impact?
That's an interesting question. I'm gonna give it a go. So I think ultimately, so we're talking about sentiment data from what I understand, and sort of like the validity of this type of stakeholder lens, applying the stakeholder lens. I think ultimately it boils down to the methodology that the provider, or perhaps even a manager internally uses to sort of select news, to select issues and how they relate to a specific company. It is an assumption, right? In like in a sentiment data set that this is what you're measuring. And I think as I've worked with sentiment data, some of the due diligence, right, that I've done on these providers is understanding, okay, how do you sort of source, or the websites or the news sources that you're looking at? How do you make sure that they're relevant to a specific business? What frameworks and methodologies do you use to select specific issues, and how do they relate, like that ESG issue, how does that relate to a company? Do you base it on financial materiality? What language do you use, et cetera, et cetera? And then also on top of it, how do you sort of address some of the biases that come from bigger companies, more popular companies getting more coverage? So there are assumptions, right? And again, inherent limitations based merely by the scope and like what that specific product want to achieve. It doesn't mean that it's a one-stop shop, but it's a very interesting sort of addition to an ESG data set, especially if you're doing price discovery, especially if you're doing that type of analysis at portfolio level. It's once you've due diligence to the provider accordingly, it's a very valid data sets in my opinion, from my experience.
Okay.
But I'm not sure this is what the question was getting at.
It was an interesting question indeed. We will try to send a type answer to the person that asked this question, and maybe to some of the other questions that we didn't have the opportunity to answer. We will send some written responses. Thank you all. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we really appreciate your insights, and hopefully we can do this sometime in the future. Thank you very much, and have all a great day.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Goodbye.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.